January 1943. North Africa. The desert is quiet before dawn, but never still. Wind moves sand against canvas walls. A lantern flickers inside a command tent. Maps lie flat on a folding table, their edges weighted with empty shell casings. Radios hum softly, waiting. Dwight D.P. Eisenhower stands alone, reading reports that refuse to align. Lines of advance are faster than expected. Casualty numbers are lower. Units once described as undisciplined now move with precision. The name attached to those reports is familiar, too familiar. George S. Patton. Eisenhower pauses. He knows Patton's reputation, the polished helmet, the sharp tongue, the theatrical confidence that unsettles superiors and inspires subordinates. A man many believe is reckless, a general some quietly consider unfit for modern war, and yet the evidence on the paper suggests something else entirely. This does not look like chaos. This does not look like luck. This looks like control. Eisenhower reads again. Slower this time. The numbers hold. The timing makes sense. The battlefield behavior contradicts the man he thinks he knows. For a moment, the Supreme Allied Commander allows a thought he does not voice. That can't be Patton. The doubt lingers not about the results, but about the man behind them. And that doubt opens a deeper question, shaped by a world already at war. By the time Eisenhower stood in that tent, the war had already rewritten the rules of leadership. In January 1943, the Second World War was no longer a European conflict. It was a global test of endurance, production, and command. The Axis powers still controlled vast territory. German forces occupied most of continental Europe. In the east, the Red Army was bleeding itself white around Stalingrad. In the Pacific, the United States was fighting an entirely different kind of war, island by island, learning hard lessons with every landing. America's entry into the war had been sudden and violent. Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941, ended isolation in a single morning. The United States mobilized faster than any nation in history, but speed did not equal experience. The Army expanded from a peacetime force into a mass organization almost overnight. Officers who had trained for years without combat now found themselves commanding men in real battle, under real fire, against a veteran enemy. Dwight Eisenhower was one of them. He had never commanded troops in combat before 1942. His career had been shaped in offices, staff colleges, and planning rooms. He was known for his ability to coordinate, to listen, to synthesize opposing views. George Marshall trusted him. That trust propelled Eisenhower upward at a speed that surprised even those close to him. By mid-1942, he was responsible for one of the largest and most complex Allied operations of the war, Operation Torch. The Allied landings in North Africa were designed to open a second front against the Axis, relieve pressure on the Soviet Union, and give American forces their first real test against German troops. It was also a political operation involving British forces, Vichy French units, and fragile alliances held together by necessity rather than confidence. For Eisenhower, Torch was more than an operation. It was a proving ground for the American Army and for the generals who would shape the war's outcome. Among those generals was George Smith Patton Jr. Patton had been preparing for this war long before it arrived. He was a student of armored warfare, influenced by European theorists and his own experiences in World War I, where he had led one of the first American tank units in combat. Between wars, he trained relentlessly. He wrote. He studied. He drilled his units with an intensity that bordered on obsession. But Patton's reputation often overshadowed his preparation. He was flamboyant in an army that valued restraint. He spoke bluntly when diplomacy was safer. He demanded absolute discipline, enforcing standards down to the smallest detail. To some, this made him a throwback and anachronism in an era moving toward coordination and coalition warfare. To others, it made him dangerous. Eisenhower knew Patton well enough to be cautious. They had served together before the war, shared ideas, and clashed over methods. Eisenhower respected Patton's intellect, but worried about his temperament. In a coalition war, personality could be as lethal as poor tactics. When Torch began in November 1942, the American Army entered combat with optimism and uncertainty in equal measure. The landing succeeded, but the campaign that followed exposed deep flaws. Units lacked coordination. Commanders hesitated. German forces, smaller in number but rich in experience, exploited every mistake. For Eisenhower, the early weeks in North Africa were sobering. He faced pressure from British allies who questioned American readiness. He faced political expectations from Washington. And he faced the reality that not all generals were equal under fire. Some froze, some adapted, some surprised him. Reports began to filter in about discipline tightened, about formations moving faster, about units responding decisively under pressure. They came from sectors Patton influenced, commanded, or reshaped. Yet Eisenhower hesitated to accept what the paper suggested. Because if these reports were accurate, then Patton was not the reckless figure many believed him to be. He was something else, and that possibility would force Eisenhower to reconsider not only Patton but the kind of leadership this war demanded. The question was no longer whether the United States could fight. It was who should lead when the fighting turned unforgiving. North Africa stripped illusions quickly. The terrain offered no cover for uncertainty. Open desert rewarded speed and punished hesitation. Dust clouds revealed movement from miles away. Armored columns that stalled became targets. Infantry that failed to coordinate with tanks paid in blood. For the American Army, these conditions exposed painful weaknesses. In February 1943, at Kasserine Pass in Tunisia, German forces under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel delivered a sharp blow to inexperienced U.S. units. Command structures faltered. Orders conflicted. Units withdrew without coordination. The defeat was not catastrophic, but it was humiliating. It confirmed every doubt Allied planners had quietly harbored about American readiness. Eisenhower absorbed the lesson without deflection. He did not deny the failure. He examined it. The problem, he concluded, was not courage. American soldiers fought hard. The problem was leadership clarity, discipline, and the ability to impose order under pressure. Change came quickly. Commanders were reassigned. Training intensified, standards tightened, and into this moment of reckoning stepped George Patton. Patton was given command of the 12th Corps in March 1943. The assignment was deliberate. Eisenhower knew Patton's reputation for discipline could shock a battered force back into shape. He also knew the risk. Patton's methods were uncompromising. His tolerance for deviation was minimal. If mishandled, morale could fracture further. Patton did not hesitate. He enforced helmet discipline immediately. Weapons were inspected. Salutes were demanded. Units were reorganized. Officers who could not meet expectations were replaced. The changes were visible within days. Soldiers noticed. So did the enemy. Patton's approach was not about appearance alone. Discipline created predictability. Predictability enabled speed. Speed denied the enemy time to react. In late March and April 1943, two corps began to move differently. Advances were tighter. Coordination between armor, infantry, and artillery improved. Casualty rates dropped. Engagements ended faster. These were not dramatic breakthroughs. They were controlled advances, the kind that rarely attract headlines but win campaigns. Eisenhower watched closely. He received briefings that contrasted sharply with earlier reports. Patton's corps did not overextend. It did not collapse under pressure. It maintained cohesion even when plans changed mid-operation. Still, doubts lingered. Patton's personality remained volatile. His language toward subordinates could be harsh. His public image troubled Allied leadership, especially in a war where unity mattered as much as victory. British commanders respected effectiveness but distrusted unpredictability. As the North African campaign concluded in May 1943 with the surrender of Axis forces in Tunisia, the Allies turned their attention northward to Sicily. Operation Husky would be larger, riskier, and politically delicate. It would involve amphibious landings, multinational coordination, and rapid exploitation inland. Command errors would carry consequences far beyond the battlefield. Eisenhower faced a decision. Patton's performance in Tunisia had been effective. His results were undeniable, but war did not forgive only mistakes of tactics. It punished failures of judgment, temperament, and restraint. Assigning Patton a major role in Sicily meant accepting the full weight of his character along with his competence. Eisenhower proved the assignment. He would soon learn that effectiveness and instability could exist in the same man, and that recognizing the difference between them required looking closer than reputation allowed. As preparations for Sicily moved forward, the tension between outcome and conduct tightened, setting the stage for scrutiny from every direction. The battlefield was about to test not only Patton's methods, but Eisenhower's ability to judge them. George S. Patton was not a mystery to those who served under him, but he was rarely simple. He demanded more than competence. He demanded belief. Belief in speed, belief in aggression, belief that hesitation killed. To some soldiers, this clarity was liberating. In a war defined by uncertainty, Patton gave them rules that did not change. To others, it was exhausting. Patton's intensity filled every space he entered. He spoke of destiny, of history, of obligation. He believed deeply in the moral dimension of warfare, that victory required not only skill, but will. This belief shaped his leadership style. Praise was rare. Criticism was public. Failure was personal. Yet beneath the hardness was calculation. Patton studied his enemies carefully. He read their manuals. He anticipated reactions. His aggression was rarely impulsive. It was timed. This duality unsettled observers. Men who saw only the surface mistook performance for recklessness. Men who worked closely with him often saw something else, a commander who reduced fear by replacing it with motion. Eisenhower understood this contradiction intellectually. Accepting it emotionally was harder. Eisenhower's leadership style stood in quiet contrast. He did not dominate rooms. He balanced them. His strength lay in absorbing disagreement and shaping it into decision. In coalition warfare, this skill was indispensable. British commanders, American subordinates, political leaders all demanded consideration. Patton complicated this balance. Every success Patton delivered came with an unspoken cost. Allied leaders worried how his behavior would be perceived by civilians, by allies, by a press eager for controversy. Eisenhower knew that battlefield success did not grant immunity from consequence. His task was not to choose the most effective general in isolation, but the one whose effectiveness could be sustained without fracturing the alliance. Watching Patton meant weighing results against risk constantly. German commanders did not underestimate Patton. Intelligence assessments noted the change in American tempo when Patton's influence appeared. Attacks became faster. Defensive lines were probed relentlessly. Withdrawal routes were threatened sooner. This mattered. The Wehrmacht respected aggression when it was controlled. They had seen recklessness before. Patton did not fit that pattern. His movement suggested planning masked as audacity. For Eisenhower, this enemy recognition carried weight. When experienced opponents adjusted behavior, it signaled legitimacy. But enemy respect did not erase internal concern. The same qualities that unsettled German planners unsettled Allied command rooms. And Sicily would magnify those qualities under unforgiving scrutiny. Patton's battlefield methods were often mistaken for raw aggression. In reality, they were structured to an almost mechanical degree. He believed discipline created freedom. Units that moved precisely could move faster. Orders that were simple reduced confusion under fire. In Sicily, Patton emphasized clear objectives, rapid exploitation, and relentless pressure. He pushed formations forward not to satisfy ego, but to prevent the enemy from stabilizing. Speed, to Patton, was moral. It saved lives by shortening battles. Eisenhower studied after-action reports closely. Patton's advances showed fewer instances of hesitation-induced casualties. Supply lines kept pace. Command posts relocated smoothly. These were not accidents. Yet discipline enforced through fear carried its own risks. War erodes restraint. The stress placed on commanders is cumulative. Fatigue blurs judgment. Repetition dulls empathy. Patton operated near that edge. His intolerance for perceived weakness hardened over time. Especially in environments where casualties mounted quickly, the line between motivating force and destructive pressure grew thinner. Eisenhower understood this danger intimately. A general's behavior could ripple outward, shaping not only battlefield outcomes, but the ethical tone of an entire force. Victory achieved at the cost of internal fracture was not victory at all. Reports of Patton's conduct began to circulate, initially vague, then specific enough to demand attention. The U.S. Army in 1943 was still defining itself. Doctrine evolved through failure as much as success. Senior leaders knew they were shaping precedents that would influence the remainder of the war. How much volatility could the institution tolerate in exchange for effectiveness? Patton became a test case. Protecting him without accountability risked endorsing excess. Removing him risked losing a uniquely effective commander at a critical moment. Eisenhower stood between these pressures, aware that his response would echo far beyond Sicily. The question sharpened. Was Patton an indispensable instrument or a liability waiting to detonate? The answer would not be theoretical. It would be forced by events, at a specific place and time, when command authority collided with human limits. July 1943. Sicily. The invasion began before dawn. Allied aircraft droned overhead as paratroopers scattered across the island, many landing far from their intended drop zones. Rough seas broke landing formations, units arrived disorganized, equipment soaked, communications fractured. This was the kind of operation where chaos could spread quickly. Patton's 7th Army came ashore on the southern coast. Initial objectives were limited, secure ports, protect the flank of the British 8th Army, and prepare for a push inland. Patton accepted the mission, then immediately began to stretch it. Opportunities appeared. German and Italian defenses wavered under pressure. Patton pushed his units forward aggressively, exploiting gaps before they could close. His movements were fast, sometimes faster than the plans written days earlier. Eisenhower monitored the advance from afar. Reports were contradictory. Some praised decisive action, others warned of overreach, of coordination risks with British forces advancing from the east. Patton's success created friction, not failure. The deeper Patton drove into Sicily, the more visible his command style became. Then came the incidents. In August 1943, during inspections of field hospitals, Patton encountered soldiers suffering from what was then called battle fatigue, exhaustion, psychological collapse under sustained combat stress. Patton, shaped by an older understanding of courage, reacted harshly. He struck 2 soldiers on separate occasions. The acts were brief, the consequences were not. Word traveled upward through the chain of command. Medical officers filed reports. Witnesses spoke carefully but clearly. The incidents reached Eisenhower not as rumor, but as documented fact. For Eisenhower, the moment crystallized everything he had been weighing. Patton's battlefield effectiveness was no longer the only variable. His judgment under stress had crossed a boundary that could not be ignored. The question was no longer whether Patton could win battles. It was whether the cost of his leadership was becoming unacceptable. Eisenhower prepared to act not publicly, not theatrically, but decisively. The war did not pause while he decided, and the decision he made would reshape Patton's role and define Eisenhower's authority in ways neither man could reverse. Eisenhower did not respond immediately. He read the reports multiple times. He sought corroboration. He separated hearsay from testimony. The facts remained unchanged. 2 incidents, 2 hospitals, soldiers already broken by combat. The evidence forced a choice that could not be delegated. On August 10, 1943, Eisenhower wrote directly to Patton. The letter was measured in tone, but absolute in meaning. Eisenhower expressed admiration for Patton's operational skill. He acknowledged the speed and effectiveness of the 7th Army. Then he addressed the incidents plainly. There would be no justification. There would be no dismissal. Patton's actions were unacceptable. Eisenhower ordered him to apologize to the soldiers and medical staff involved. More significantly, he removed Patton from frontline command. The decision was not announced publicly. It was executed quietly, deliberately, to preserve Allied cohesion while enforcing accountability. Patton complied. He apologized. He accepted responsibility. He did not argue the facts. For a man whose identity was built around command, the removal was devastating. He remained in theater, but without authority over combat operations. To outside observers, the decision seemed restrained. To those inside Allied command, it was seismic. Eisenhower had chosen principle over performance. The risk was real. Sicily was not the end of the war. Larger operations loomed. Removing one of the most aggressive commanders in the American Army created uncertainty. Some questioned whether Eisenhower had acted too cautiously, too politically. Eisenhower did not waver. He understood that leadership in a total war demanded more than battlefield success. It required moral coherence. Armies that lost their ethical center eventually lost discipline, and discipline was the foundation of Patton's own effectiveness. The irony was unavoidable. The man who preached discipline had violated it at the moment it mattered most. Patton's absence was felt immediately. Planning rooms adjusted. Command dynamics shifted. Other generals stepped forward. some cautiously, some hesitantly. Eisenhower watched the machine continue without Patton at its forefront. He did not celebrate the decision. He carried it because he also understood something else. Patton was not finished. The question now was whether Patton could be used again without repeating the same fracture. The answer would unfold not on the battlefield, but in the quieter spaces where deception, restraint, and trust shaped the next phase of the war. The removal of George Patton from frontline command sent a controlled shock through Allied headquarters. Officially, nothing dramatic had happened. No press releases. No public reprimand. The war effort moved forward without interruption. Yet within command circles, the meaning was unmistakable. Eisenhower had drawn a line that even battlefield success could not erase. Patton remained in Sicily, but his role changed completely. He was assigned administrative duties, planning tasks, observational roles without authority to direct combat operations. For a man defined by movement and command, the stillness was punishing. Letters written during this period reveal a man acutely aware of his own failure not in tactics but in restraint. Eisenhower maintained distance. He did not humiliate Patton publicly, nor did he shield him privately. The response was calibrated. Accountability without destruction. Discipline without spectacle. This approach reflected Eisenhower's understanding of command as stewardship rather than dominance. Within the U.S. Army, the message was absorbed quickly. Commanders understood that effectiveness alone would not excuse misconduct. Medical officers felt too firm. Soldiers, particularly those affected by combat exhaustion, saw a shift subtle but real in how psychological strain was acknowledged. The consequences extended beyond Patton. Allied planning for the invasion of Italy and the eventual return to Western Europe demanded trust between nations, between services, and between commanders. Eisenhower's action reinforced that trust at a critical moment. Still, uncertainty lingered. Patton was too capable to discard, too flawed to restore without condition. British leaders watched carefully. So did German intelligence. Patton's absence from frontline command did not go unnoticed. Enemy analysts debated whether his removal signaled Allied weakness or internal division. Eisenhower allowed the ambiguity to exist. He had not ended Patton's career. He had paused it. That pause would become an opportunity, one shaped not by force, but by perception. As the Allies began planning their return to France, Patton's reputation, once a liability, would be repurposed into something strategically invaluable. The aftermath of discipline was about to evolve into an instrument of deception. By early 1944, the war had shifted again. The Allies were preparing for their most ambitious operation yet, the return to Western Europe. Every detail of the coming invasion depended on secrecy, misdirection, and psychological pressure. German defenses along the Atlantic Wall were formidable, but they relied heavily on anticipation. Where would the Allies land? When would they come? Patton's enforced distance from frontline command created a paradox. He was sidelined but visible. German intelligence still considered Patton the Allies' most aggressive and dangerous field commander. His reputation, forged in North Africa and Sicily, had not faded. If anything, his absence from combat raised questions. The Germans searched for patterns, convinced that Patton was being held in reserve for something decisive. Eisenhower recognized the opportunity. Patton was assigned command of the notional 1st U.S. Army Group FUSEG-A force that largely existed on paper. Inflatable tanks, dummy landing craft, false radio traffic. Patton's presence gave credibility to the illusion. German analysts concluded that the main Allied blow would fall at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. Patton played the role precisely. He adhered to restrictions. He followed orders. He became, for the first time in the war, restrained by design rather than temperament. His value now lay not in movement, but in stillness, being seen where he was not intended to fight. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces landed in Normandy. German reserves waited. They waited for Patton. Days passed, then weeks. The deception held. By the time Patton finally returned to combat command with the Third Army in August 1944, the strategic moment had shifted decisively in the Allies' favor. His return was different, still aggressive, still fast, but tempered by experience and by the knowledge that command could be taken away as decisively as it was granted. Eisenhower and Patton never spoke openly about Sicily again. They did not need to. The war had absorbed the lesson. Effectiveness required control. Control required judgment. Patton's career did not end in disgrace, it was reshaped, and Eisenhower's authority, once questioned by some, emerged strengthened, defined by the ability to see beyond reputation and act before damage became irreversible. The consequences of that decision echoed far beyond Sicily, into the final collapse of Nazi Germany and into the post-war understanding of military leadership itself, which leaves a final question, one that history continues to examine quietly. Leadership in war is rarely about certainty. It is about judgment made under pressure with incomplete information and irreversible consequences. In 1943, Dwight D. Eisenhower faced a choice that no manual could resolve. George Patton was effective. He was also volatile. Both truths existed at the same time. What Eisenhower understood, perhaps before anyone else, was that modern war demanded more than victory at any cost. It demanded coherence. Armies fight with weapons, but they endure through discipline, trust, and restraint. When those erode, success becomes temporary. Patton was not removed because he failed on the battlefield. He was removed because he failed to recognize the limits of his authority over human endurance. Eisenhower did not destroy him for it. He corrected him. That decision required confidence without ego. Years later, Patton would again lead men in battle, moving faster than any American army in Europe, exploiting breakthroughs that hastened the end of the war. Eisenhower would command a coalition that held together through strain, compromise, and quiet authority. The moment in Sicily did not define either man in isolation. It defined the relationship between brilliance and control. When Eisenhower looked closer, he did not see a caricature or a legend. He saw a tool that had to be handled carefully or not at all. By choosing accountability over admiration, he preserved both the army and the man. History often remembers victories. Less often does it remember the decisions that prevented deeper failure. But it is in those moments, quiet, deliberate, and restrained, that the shape of modern leadership was forged.